In today's video, we check out the most shocking things you'll find in rivers and swamps, from scuba-diving spiders to a one-of-a-kind Russian tank. But before that, this piece of treasure certainly isn't something you'd expect. Number 8. Ancient brothel coin. We lose change all the time, only for them to turn up when you don't need them. Too bad for this poor dude's brothel token though, because it was only discovered 2,000 years after he lost it. The ancient token had washed up on the banks of the Thames, which is the longest river in England. It was picked up by a local who was scanning the area for treasure using a metal detector. The coin wasn't like any he was familiar with, so he did the right thing and donated it to the Museum of London. Upon cleaning up the mysterious artifact, the museum curator had a bit of a laugh at what she saw. It was a token made out of bronze, depicting a man and a woman doing things that are usually done in a brothel. Similar tokens have been discovered elsewhere, but this was the very first of its kind seen in the United Kingdom. It's amazing how the mud had preserved its condition for the last couple of millennia. Number 7. A missing leg. We've all taken time off work before for one reason or another, and spending a day out with a friend by canoeing down the river seemed like a terrific idea. At least until they found someone's leg sticking out of a beaver dam. Elliot Fuller and Jason Franklin were both horrified at the idea of finding a dead body for themselves. But thankfully, it was just a lost prosthetic. Within moments, they found the lost leg's owner through a post on Craigslist made 20 days ago. A man named Mark Warner had indeed lost that very leg during a recent accident. His canoe had flipped over during a fishing trip. He managed to save his fishing gear and cooler, but his prosthetic was nowhere to be found, probably swept away by the river's currents. Mark had other prosthetics for different occasions, so this loss initially didn't bother him too much. But thanks to a friend who convinced him to post on Craigslist, he gets his hunting leg back, along with a great story to tell. Everyone gets a happy ending too. The friends got a $50 reward from Mr. Warner for their efforts. Number 6. Scuba-diving spiders. Humankind was exploring the ocean's depths many centuries before the invention of submarines and scuba gear. The key invention of the time period was called a diving bell, and it looks and functions like you'd expect. The diving bell spider, also called the water spider, got its name from this Renaissance period invention. This creature spends most of its life underwater, and it even breathes oxygen unlike the rest of its arachnid relatives. So how does it keep from drowning, you ask? It builds its very own diving bell. The spider begins by picking its spot, between two stalks of algae as a solid choice. Then it spins a bell-shaped web anchored to the underwater plants. Next, it swims to the surface and collects bubbles on the surface of the water. These bubbles are carried down and released inside the web. Gradually, the dome begins to fill with air and expands to a size that can comfortably fit the spider, oxygen and all. Before Roger Seymour discovered these fascinating creatures, it was assumed that these spiders need to resurface every 30 minutes to replenish the oxygen in their diving bell. But after collecting and studying spiders from the Ida River in Germany, the oxygen charts were through the roof and beyond expectation. This bell is so effective at absorbing oxygen from the water that the spider only needs to replenish it once a day. And if its skills haven't impressed you so far, this one truly will. It can use the bell to create a sort of scuba skin for itself, allowing it to breathe while swimming and hunting underwater. Who needs gills when you have submarine spider skills? Number 5. Radioactive water. Russia, then the Soviet Union, was an early adopter of nuclear technology for generating electricity. But decades later, people who've worked or lived around these places are suffering the consequences of the state's secrecy. The Techa River is a reminder of what not to do when it comes to handling nuclear fallout. Chernobyl's reactor meltdown might have made it obvious that the Soviets were incredibly bad at the safety aspect of running a nuclear plant. But this was already suspected to be a problem even years before. The true extent of radioactive exposure was not fully understood by scientists during this time. One of the early incidents of ignorance and irresponsibility happened at Mayak, where the first Soviet nuclear complex was built. The Mayak complex was built after World War II, and its purpose was to create plutonium to give the Soviet Union an edge in the arms race. For 7 years, starting on 1949, a total of 76 million cubic meters of radioactive waste was dumped into the Techa River. At the time, 28,000 residents spanning 40 villages lived along the edge of the river, most of them dependent on its water. Owing to the lackadaisical standards of safety, more than 500,000 people who lived in the region were irradiated, and each was subject to as much as 20 times the radiation suffered by the victims of the Chernobyl disaster. People living downstream were hit the worst. Medical experts have found an increase in the likelihood of leukemia, breast cancer, and genetic anomalies in offspring, all because of radiation exposure. Despite this, little effort is made to warn the thousands of people who still live nearby. Cleanup operations are 0 to 0. In fact, ask Russian authorities today and they will tell you that no such leak exists. As a result of this intentional misinformation, local people still use the river for food and recreation, and they are the ones suffering for it. Number 4. 6 dead bodies. 52 years. That's how long 3 teens were presumed missing before a 1969 Chevy Camaro was pulled from the bottom of Foss Lake in Oklahoma, with their remains inside. Jimmy Williams, Leah Gale Johnson, and Thomas Michael Rios were last seen entering that very car on the way to an out-of-town football game back in 1970. Saya, Oklahoma was a quiet town that quickly became abuzz with theories about what could have happened to 3 of their own. From involvement with a drug syndicate to joining the counterculture movement, everyone was just trying to make sense of this abrupt disappearance. And if things weren't mysterious enough, police found another Chevy near the Camaro's resting place under the water. This time, 3 older folk, John Alva Porter, Claiborne Hammack, and Nora Marie Duncan, were found inside. Like the teens, they were last found entering the car that ultimately became their tomb. Police couldn't find any evidence of foul play between the 2 cases, despite this being the prevailing theory by the townsfolk. The more likely story was that both cars had sped through a roadside boat ramp by mistake. This launched their vehicles into the air before splashing down into the lake, which, as you know, ended with their deaths. What else can we say about these unfortunate incidents? Always keep your eyes on the road when driving. Now it's time for our best pick. If you see this in a swamp, you might want to run away. But you can certainly look at it up close too, at least until it's there. Find out more about this monster next. Number 3. Swamp Monster. We don't know who would even want to hang out by a swamp, but if you see a human-like figure walking towards you from the murkish water, you better run away. Fortunately, these moss-covered monstrosities are merely inanimate works of art. Sculptor Sophie Prestigia Como created an intricate setup at a natural reserves territory in France, meant to reflect the tense dialogue between man and nature. Each day, the creatures move locations and positions around the reserve. Then there are days that they completely disappear, eliciting both surprise and disappointment from their visitors. While this is meant to be performance art, its realism was more than sufficient to feed the fuel of a real swamp monster lurking somewhere out there. Number 2. Hundreds of frozen human skeletons. This lake, hidden behind a challenging day-long trek, holds a deep, dark secret. Its official name is Rupkund Lake, but locals call it by a couple of names more befitting of its reputation: Skeleton Lake and Mystery Lake. If you haven't guessed it yet, the names refer to the hundreds of skeletal remains scattered around and under the frozen waterfall. Rupkund Lake is frozen over most of the year, but for a short time in the summer, the snow melts, revealing the skeletons in more detail. It's both incredible and horrifying how some of the skeletons look remarkably well preserved. Just what could have caused this high-altitude graveyard? A popular theory explains how the skeletons were of the Indian king and his entourage, all of whom were killed in a blizzard. Another one suggests that the remains belong to Indian soldiers who tried to invade Tibet during the Sino-Sikh War, only to fail and perish in retreat. No to both. At least that's what a 2019 study says. We think it's pretty legit too because it took 28 researchers 5 years to put this together. 5 years! And the worst job of all was to collect and test dozens of these skeletons. But thanks to these brave souls, we now know that these people were of different races and died at different times. No way one huge catastrophe did this if one victim died 1,000 years after the other. We are seriously clueless, guys, and the researchers are too. Looks like the Lake of Mystery strikes again. Number 1. A Russian tank from World War II. Once upon a time, Russia was a world superpower with a mighty military. During World War II, its enemies felt the full brunt of the Soviet war machine. 35 million soldiers and over 100,000 tanks ought to strike fear in any country. Those tanks were pretty great too. In fact, they were the best on the battlefield until Germany decided to build one better 2 years later. Still, you know it's a good day when you find a T-34 tank, especially this variant that's the last of its kind. The tank was discovered at the Don River in Russia. Miraculously, it was in great shape. There were no bodies in the cockpit, so it must have fallen into the river by accident. Lucky thing that its armaments were offloaded too, as the risk of an unstable explosion would have prevented them from pulling it out in the first place. Authorities think that with proper restoration, it can be restored to running condition. Now, wouldn't that be a sight?